Safe to assume that we are going to be hearing about these sorts of things over and over again. The Kremlin has declared a temporary 3-day ceasefire from May 8th to May 10th. Yes, I am sure that it will be welcome news to anyone on the ground who believes there actually will be a pause. However, one does not simply declare a ceasefire, especially when one has a poor track record of following through on them. That is why today we will explore how we got here, why ceasefires can work, emphasis on can, what Russia might be trying to accomplish with this, and how there is an underappreciated downside risk to the strategy. But first, some background on the timing of what is happening. The Kremlin's proposal coincides with Victory Day, commemorating the end of the European theater of World War II. You might be familiar with the festivities thanks to the annual parade in Moscow. Buckle up, because you will be seeing a ton of B-roll from them during this video. Ceasefires, of course, have been a recurring point of discussion since Trump re-entered office. That said, in terms of actually reaching one, the important thing, the sides have not gotten very far. You might recall the Trump-promoted infrastructure truce, effectively meaning that Ukraine would stop targeting Russian oil facilities in exchange for Russia not bombing Ukrainian cities. Well, for all of the talk of the parties implementing a truce, it promptly went nowhere. Then there was the Kremlin's unilaterally declared Easter ceasefire, and that also promptly went nowhere. In fact, the next time that you see this image, assume that the headline is going to describe a failure. Understandably, few think that Victory Day will be any different. It will promptly go nowhere. You can see that the earlier ceasefire came with particular scrutiny from left-leaning news outlets. However, and previewing a point about a backlash effect that we will get to later, right-leaning sources targeted Putin's character, describing him as sick and demented. Regarding the proposed ceasefire, the right tended to put it in the context of a productive conversation between Trump and Zelensky at Pope Francis's funeral, while the left highlighted the widely held belief that Russia is dragging its feet to try to feign alignment with the Trump administration's priorities. And you know how I know all of this. It is thanks to today's returning sponsor, Ground News. With so much going on right now, Ground News' For You tab has been an invaluable way for me to catch up on what's happening when I have a spare 5 minutes. And by visiting ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can access all of these features and more with a 40% discount on their Vantage plan. So thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support of this channel. Now, contrary to recent events, ceasefires can work. And I worry that we will eventually run into a problem where a ceasefire does happen, but everyone wrongly believes that it will last a second. They do require a few key elements to be sustainable, though, and only one of them looks good given the current situation. Let's start with whether a ceasefire here is mutually beneficial. As a default, this is an easier hurdle to clear than you might think. War is not all cute puppies found on the DoD photo archives. People die, and whatever the true numbers are, it has been a non-trivial amount for both sides. But when you have a ceasefire, people do not die. Thus, ceasefire good for Ukraine and good for Russia. No ceasefire bad for Ukraine and bad for Russia. Well, it would be nice if it were that simple anyway. The problem here is that there is still an unresolved underlying conflict between the two. And while there may on occasion be reason to put a pause on the war, perhaps a national holiday, Christmas during a great war long ago, or a general sense of mental exhaustion, the zero-sum aspect of winning and losing is still important. Plotting this out, you may naturally think that both sides would prefer a mutual ceasefire to mutual continued conflict. But if the ceasefire would cause a change to the fundamentals of the underlying conflict, then, well, Russia's preferences may look like this instead. Specifically, as has been the running theme for months now, Russia controls the tempo on the ground and between the trenches. Ukraine, meanwhile, would benefit by having more time to establish defensive lines to slow down Russian advances. Yes, there have been improvements there over the last few months, but Russia is still making gains. As a result, the situation may indeed look like this. But, for the sake of argument, let's imagine that Russia does prefer a ceasefire. Maybe we are just too suspicious at this point. Even so, we would not be out of the woods yet. When a ceasefire begins, each party must decide whether to follow through on the proposal. After all, you cannot unilaterally implement a ceasefire, as depicted earlier. You could declare one, and then when the time comes, go ahead and continue fighting, all while the other side is in full compliance. And, actually, that looks like an attractive outcome. You can take advantage of your opponent letting down its guard. It leads to an awful outcome for your opponent, but why should you care? It is your opponent after all. Of course, the situation is similar when the parties reverse their strategies. Now, many of you may recognize this as a prisoner's dilemma incentive structure, which seems doomed to produce the war outcome for everyone. Some of you, however, may more precisely recognize this as a repeated prisoner's dilemma. And if you are familiar with the book The Evolution of Cooperation, or perhaps viewed the Veritasium video on the subject, then you may recognize that there is a way out. Quick aside, you really should read The Evolution of Cooperation if you have not before. It was a huge eye-opener for me when I read it 17 years ago. Yeah, I'm getting old. And its author, Robert Axelrod, has had French toast levels of success during his career. And if you are thinking to yourself, what the heck is French toast levels of success? Then please stick around after the regular video ends, and I will regale you with a story about the time that I met him. Anyway, the key insight is that there is a disincentive to betraying the opponent's trust here. Once your opponent has an opportunity to react to your defection, they will no longer cooperate, and the situation will devolve back into a war. And that means a whole lot of foregone cooperation over the long run. One determinant of whether such a betrayal is worthwhile is how fast the victim can switch to retaliation. If the aggressor is only getting this outcome for a second, before the victim protects itself by shifting to reciprocated war, well, then the aggressor will see little benefit from breaking the cooperative strategy. In contrast, if the victim will be slow to react and stuck in the bad outcome for hours, days, or weeks, then you know who will want to take advantage of the opportunity. Mercifully, this is where the modern battlefield provides some relief, if battlefields are capable of providing relief in any sense of the word. Now that there are drones everywhere, combatants can observe violations of a truce and quickly correct their footing. However, this discussion hints at the final problem with pauses to fighting. What exactly is a pause in fighting? Those labels are helpful for our own understanding, but they are hopelessly vague for real-world implementation. Without clear boundaries, it is hard to know when a violation should revert your strategy back to open warfare. Sure, it is a ceasefire, so shooting the other side is clearly prohibited. But how about pulling bodies from no man's land? That seems reasonable, but you are venturing into what is supposed to be a combat area. Or digging fortifications? You are not actually shooting anyone there, of course, but you are putting yourself in a better position to shoot later. Whether that is a breach would seem to be up for interpretation if you did not directly negotiate the rules earlier. And that is why it is hard to take the Kremlin's unilaterally declared ceasefire seriously. There are no rules to it, so it is a jungle out there. Even if you think that the situation looks like this, good luck getting everyone to follow through when no one knows what the labels mean. So when you see the headline, Kremlin calls Ukrainian response to Putin's ceasefire offer ambiguous, note the irony that the proposal itself is ambiguous, and you cannot get follow-through that way. And thus, we can now shift to discussing what Russia's strategy here might be. Rather than focus on the international relations aspect of this, it may help to think about the Kremlin's domestic incentives. Remember, the ceasefire is scheduled for Victory Day, And if you have learned anything from all of this B-roll that you have been watching over the last 10 minutes, it is that Victory Day is supposed to be a major party in Moscow. But big parties require lots of people be willing to attend. That might be a tough ask for those following the news, noting both Ukraine's increased ability to commit attacks deep into Russia, and specifically Ukraine hitting a high-profile target in Moscow, followed by general drone strikes in even more recent days. Thus, if you are Putin, you declare a ceasefire during the Victory Day celebrations. Kyiv, meanwhile, would seem to be obligated to at least pay lip service to the idea, lest Trump think that Ukraine is uninterested in bringing the war to a close. You then use that to allay any fears around the country that Victory Day parades in Moscow or elsewhere will be security risks. Even better, it constrains Ukraine from conducting attacks there at all. That would require foresight and planning from Ukraine well in advance of Victory Day, meaning that an attack there is evidence to Trump that Kyiv was never buying into the ceasefire, even if simultaneously Russia was planning to break the ceasefire on the front lines. Indeed, on the front lines, there is little worry about violations giving Trump direct evidence of the Kremlin's duplicity. It may be straightforward for those on the front lines to know whether Han or Greedo shot first, but the fog of war makes it virtually impossible for anyone in a far-flung capital to have anything beyond a weak, circumstantial idea about what happened. Thus, in short, Trump's incentive structure encourages exactly this type of running in circles. However, it seems that Kyiv chose not to bite, hence the lukewarm response to the ceasefire proposal. Meantime, Ukraine is warning of attacks on Moscow that day, though of the false flag variety. I found the social media reaction to this headline amusing, where if all you looked at was the headline, you might think that Ukraine was openly threatening to bomb the same parade that foreign dignitaries are attending. Quick reminder that Xi Jinping will be one of them, and it might not be in Kyiv's best interest to bring China into the war. If Ukraine were to attempt a strike in that general neighborhood, the attacks would have to be careful to target the materiel nearby, or the parade staging ground. Putin himself would be a tactical nightmare given the potential for collateral damage all around him. But you can understand how the fact that we are having this conversation at all is not reassuring to anyone thinking about taking part in the broader Victory Day celebrations around the country. In any case, Ukrainian cooperation or not, the Kremlin strategy does not come without risk. The fog of war may be problematic for any one particular incident, but stalling indefinitely may eventually raise suspicions. Since Trump came into office, my guide to interpreting the news is to ask yourself two questions, which will explain about 90% of Trump's behavior. 1. Does this thing make Trump the center of the news day? It is better if the story portrays him positively, but even bad publicity is good publicity. And 2. What does this have to do with China? Well, question 2 explains Trump's interest in a ceasefire. Ukraine is a distraction from the Indo-Pacific pivot, and China is getting rich off of cheap oil in the interim. Point 1 about Trump being the center of attention should be the Kremlin's concern. Here is another way to think about that. Trump is the protagonist in his own story, and the rest of us are NPCs. And I mean all of the rest of us, from Mr. Lines on Maps to Volodymyr Zelensky to Vladimir Putin. If you remember Trump getting very excited to receive an invitation to have dinner with the king, well, that is why. You can't even do that in Grand Theft Auto, and certainly not in the year of our Lord 2025. And if you think back to the Oval Office meltdown, one way to interpret the affair is that Trump got the sense that Zelensky thought that Ukraine could dictate their relationship. A few seconds later, we started getting a bizarre conversation about who had the cards. You could imagine a situation where Trump wakes up one day and decides that Putin has been playing him all along. Trump then takes it personally. Consistent with his wanting to stay front and center in the news, he then seeks to punish Putin. Well, you do not have to imagine that first half. We already got the "Vladimir, stop!" message. And just so that we are clear, and just so I can use this image again, he did not stop, which then raises the question of what happens next. Does Trump's personal offense to the situation override his larger doctrine's concern about making the Indo-Pacific pivot? For now, the Kremlin is betting that it will not. However, important conservative voices have started drifting back into Ukraine's orbit, from Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana to commentator Ben Shapiro. As a result, the wisdom of the Kremlin's bet remains up in the air. But what is not up in the air is my appreciation to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to head over to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a terrific 40% off of their Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Oh, can't forget about the French toast thing. Many moons ago, when I was in my third year as an assistant professor, I received an invitation to interview for a job at the University of Michigan. To preemptively answer the next question, they ultimately chose someone else. Such is life. In any case, the way professors interview for a job really consists of three things: 30-minute conversations inside of various professors' offices, a job talk where you present some of your recent research, and meals with faculty and grad students. Now, the schedule is brutal on the job candidate. Usually, the research presentation is at around noon to allow those in the audience to eat their lunch at the same time. What that means is that by the time you actually have food in front of you, it is about 2 p.m. So I gave my talk, and I was delighted, if a bit starving, to go to a restaurant with Robert Axelrod and one other professor. Academics are not exactly the most uptight of individuals, but you could imagine the conversations in the hallway after I left town if I, as an untenured professor, ignored the lunch menu and ate French toast. Actually, I know that is true from experience, because I have heard many people comment about that in other cases. But Robert Axelrod? Nope. He has French toast levels of success. He has no reason to care what people might say. It took him about a second to decide that he was having French toast for lunch that day. And I gotta say, sitting across the table, it looked pretty good. We could all strive to be a bit more like Bob.